Hello, my friend, and welcome to this special episode of A Call to Leadership. I'm Dr. Nate Saul, your host, and I'm so glad you are here as we embark on a profound exploration of the intricate beauty that emerges through an area we rarely would consider beautiful, and that is the struggle of our lives. We're going to dive headfirst into the notion that our stories are not simply shaped by struggle, discovering how the most challenging moments can be the very threads that make our journeys unique and meaningful. So I invite you to join me and my friend PJ Accetturo. We'll uncover the transformative power of facing adversity head on and finding strength in vulnerability. PJ, so good to have you on the show again. Thanks for being here, man.
Thank you for having me, Nate. This is maybe our fourth, fifth time. Always excited. Always a
Yeah,
pleasure.
man. Always good to have you. And you bring so much to the program as we really embark on different ways to look at leadership. And one of the ways, as you've unfolded on several episodes, is through this idea of story. And you being a person who has extreme experience in the story world, storytelling, and living out a story, being able to understand our story better, perhaps through the stories of others, whether they be nonfiction. And sometimes the fictional world has just as much to give and offer us in terms of how we understand our own lives, our own trajectory, the world around us. I've looked at from many films. Like, for example, years ago, I watched this movie called The Matrix, like many did, many times over. I'd watch it over and over again. And my wife's like, why are you watching that same movie? I felt like I was 4 years old. You know how little kids, they watch a movie, because I was gleaning different things about the movie that spoke to me in my own life. And story has a way to do that. We're all connected as humans to a story. And you know this, being a person who lives in the story genre. And one story that you're a big fan of, I'm a big fan of too. I want to unroll this a little bit for our listener, because perhaps some of our listeners haven't been exposed to this story or set of stories. They probably heard of it, and that is the story of Harry. Harry Potter.
Dun 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 dun.
I memorized that on the piano. I don't play the piano. We have a piano. My son and my wife play the piano. But I memorize that because it's just it's such an interesting sort of beginning to this story of a boy. And if you can help our listener perhaps unpack some of this story. And the reason why we're talking about this today is we're unfolding this idea of safety and trauma and challenge in life, and being able to look at it maybe perhaps through the lens of this massively successful, impactful story about this boy. And so as his story unfolds, what are some of the things that you can share about how his story begins and perhaps how it ends in a much different way?
Yeah. I'll give kind of a brief overview of Harry, and maybe we can explore some of this and some of the entrepreneurs that you've, like Jobs and Hershey and Disney, afterwards. But starting with Harry Potter, because I think we've talked before about how in Hollywood, really all stories are kind of the same story. They call it the hero's journey, the monomyth. In a sense, Star Wars is Lord of the Rings, is Harry Potter. The three are very, very formulaic, and not in a bad way, but because I think it's how stories really speak to our soul. It's actually what makes a good story. And so we're really focusing on kind of the childhood aspect of this. In Harry's case, it's the world of Harry Potter. He grew up, kind of an orphan. So he's living with his, at his aunt's house, which are called the Dursleys. And the Dursleys are the most mundane, non-magical people you can possibly imagine. They're also super grumpy British, like, she's like the perennial British Karen, like, what will the neighbors think? Kind of like that. And he's very much like a company man through and through. And Dudley's the spoiled little kid. But as a result, they have this deep shame over Harry because Harry represents a big threat to their life. He's magical. His parents were magicians, or not magicians, wizards. And, Harry sort of grows up in this cupboard, like under the stairs. And so what I want to explore today is how the trauma that, has kept us safe when we were kids often can keep us in bondage as an adult. And the real growth arc that all of us need in life comes oftentimes on confronting those childhood wounds, which were such seminal core memories, foundational moments in which we learned a particular set of behaviors.
Yeah.
But oftentimes that's kind of what we don't want, so in the case of Harry, um, how did he survive at the Dursleys' house? Well, with them having corporate guests over and he would entertain them with dinners, it's like, what was his instructions to Harry, right? It was so great because Mrs. Dursley's like, he's like, they're rehearsing, them coming over, and she's like, and I'll be in front of the fireplace welcoming our guest, and Dudley's doing this, and he looks at Harry, and Harry's like, and I'll be upstairs pretending not to exist. Of course, Dobby the house elf comes and ruins any semblance of normalcy or whatever.
It's interesting as
Yeah.
you talk about this, and I hadn't thought about this. I'd seen the Harry Potter films many times over. My son has been a huge fan. In fact, his whole bedroom was decorated in Harry Potter for a while, and I played Snape several Halloweens in a row down in Orlando at the
Oh yeah, I was
Universal
just there.
Studios, and and I had not thought about this until you just mentioned it. I wonder if there's a little of the Dursleys in us.
Hmm.
I wonder the desire. I looked into the Dursleys many times over in the film as though I looked down at them, like they should treat Harry better. They should they shouldn't be so snobby. And I wonder, you know, should I be looking at myself sometimes? Because in some ways, many of us want to keep our our ecosystem intact, and anything that threatens that ecosystem, sometimes we are upset about it. Sometimes we are perturbed. Sometimes it's annoying, and sometimes we know that we've got to endure things that perhaps are going to give us grief. Um, so just in us talking about this, I want to perhaps give the Dursleys just a little bit of grace. I know that the
Right.
movie certainly wants us to portray them in an unfavoring light, right? I mean,
Yeah.
that's the idea.
Yeah.
But they're regular people, and I think in some ways, like, I guess the point is to make it is that, man, I think even through the Dursley story, I need to examine myself. I need to examine my own I don't know what to say. Lack of maybe even narrowness about my own views, and lack of embracing of other views. And you say, well, Nate, you seem like a pretty embracing guy. But even then, like, because as soon as you say you are, then you're not. That makes sense, right?
It's good. Yeah.
Because you put up a wall. But
Yeah.
but I think the Dursleys were in their zone, and I think that they teach us a lesson. They teach
They
us a
do, and
lesson.
and I think it's related to conformity and sort of I don't know, if you will, like just it getting into a box of sort of social convention, like a sense of normalcy. They were in many ways like the most normal British family. They weren't weird. They didn't have anything that was sort of I don't know, just strange.
Yeah,
And Harry is kind of the blemish. And this is a side lesson, but I think we all are putting on those normal clothes, if you will. But in some ways, we secretly want to know that someone's weird. And some of the most iconic figures and, sort of cult like personalities and, like, I don't know, the most charismatic people are people that are a little weird because they've learned to come with an internal peace that, like, whatever. I'm weird about a lot of things, but being this big of a nerd about Harry Potter is certainly something I'm really proud to be weird about. Because in a sense, I think everyone's looking to see that in the other person of, like, you're weird too. And that makes me
yes.
feel less weird about my own weirdness.
Yes, because that's interesting, because even being a little strange when you are expected or you're classified as
Yeah.
someone who is in the norm is reassuring and refreshing. It's really an interesting point you bring up, and I'll give you an example. You've been to my office, and in my office, at my office, not in my podcast studio, I have Star Wars memorabilia. And as soon as a new client walks in and they see the lightsabers on the wall, like, wow, this is weird, right? This is not what I would expect. And I sit in my Tony Stark chair and they're like, whoa, but it's a connecting point.
Right.
And it's interesting because sometimes it's not the conformity that connects us. It's what's different about us that we share.
That's right. That's right. And that's like a whole nother episode or whatever. But, in a nutshell, I think that's just such a powerful takeaway is people are looking for vulnerability out of all of us. And the more we can step into our own inner wizard, if you will, our own inner child that's just free to be different and free to be curious, because right as we've studied with entrepreneurship, like really the most powerful and the best entrepreneurs are the ones who are the most intensely curious. It's not discipline. It's not even willpower. It's actually curiosity. That is the number one sort of superpower, right?
Indeed. Indeed. Yeah. It is the number one. It is the unequivocal, the quince non, the indisputable requirement for exceptionalism in invention
That's
and,
right.
and progress, right? It's this idea of insatiable curiosity that drives the human condition. And that curiosity is based on a desire to challenge the status quo, to challenge conventional norms, to be a little weird. In fact, even when Jobs had taken Apple back and tried to nurse it back to health, one of his first campaigns was the Think Different campaign, right? Or Think Differently. In fact, they wanted to take the ly off of the word because different was different than differently, and most people said the word differently, right? I mean, it even got to that
That's true.
level of
That's true.
of the wording. But of course, the campaign, they didn't have a product, but the campaign was, here's to the crazy ones, right? It was basically, if you're a little strange, you're a little weird, you're a little different, you're in good company because
Yep.
you just might be the kind of person who can change this world for the better. And this is where we pick up Harry
Yeah.
Potter.
I love that. And I really think one of Harry's best arcs is the fact that he's been conditioned as a child to be non-disruptive, to be quiet, like he doesn't exist. Either he's in the broom closet or he's upstairs, and that keeps him safe as a kid. But as an adult, as he steps into adulthood, the number one quality that he is to Voldemort is he is disruptive. He's not quiet. He's a thorn in his side. He's an instigator. He's kind of an anarchist. And it's all the opposite qualities that kept him safe as a kid is the things he needed to break free from to actually step into being what the world needed him to be.
Mm.
And it's the same for us.
Yeah, it's the same for us. It is indeed. And in the entrepreneurial journey, it's this exact same breaking free of the safety. And I've heard it said like this, battleships are safe in the harbor, but that's not what they're made for. And you have to decide what kind of ship you are, right? And so for me, as I unpack, my connection with Harry, it's first of all his, sometimes there's a situation to where it's considered a fluke, right? So for example, Harry was the boy who lived and not sure exactly how he lived, but then it's revealed later, there's going to be some spoilers, right? It was, if you haven't seen the films, it was through love, right? It was the love of his mother that saved him to her own demise. And so this was something that protected him, by the way, kept him safe, but it was also the one thing that caused him so much grief at the same time in life, right? It was what caused him so much tension. But at the same time, that same tension that he experienced, and we've talked about this before, was a tension that massively progressed his capabilities, massively moved into a position to where he could be a difference maker. And so sometimes what does that mean for us? It's like, okay, well, what's happening in my life today? What kind of trauma am I experiencing, or have I experienced in the past?
Right.
What kind of pain then becomes, it helps me to reframe my purpose, which then becomes the power to make progress in my life. Those are questions we have to ask ourselves in this journey of leadership, because what it does is it helps us to really better understand um, where we've perhaps created a perspective that keeps us in bondage. And so I think that's where film like Harry Potter helps us to break free, because we then begin to see our circumstances in a much different light. Like, is it something that's kept me from being a force in this world, or is it something, in fact, that helps me to become a force in this world?
That's good. Yeah, there's a really good phrase that's kind of, I hate it and I love it. It's not a blanket truth, but it's oftentimes the things we want most in life and the things we need most in life are on the other thing, are on the other side of the things we're most afraid of,
Mm,
right? And it's because, in a sense, like a lot of times those childhood traumas create identities, they create clothes that we wear for ourselves, they create labels, and in many ways they create limitations. And what does, the person who's in prison, in bondage, whatever, want the most? They want to be free. But what's the most scary thing is to, you know what I mean, to buck against those chains. The idea that like we could exist on the other side of that. I think for me, for many entrepreneurs, it's the fear of failure, fear of disappointing others, fear of, letting people down, right? Whether that's our employees, our investors, our clients, ourselves, most of all. Um, it it's this sort of weird double-edged sword where, like, we've talked about this before, but many entrepreneurs are in the Goldilocks zone of trauma. If they had too much, oftentimes we just, I don't know, become product of the system. We get thrown in jail, like whatever. We die. Like it really, there can be too much trauma early on.
yeah.
But if you have too little, I don't think it conditions you to have ambition, to change your life, to have exert control, make a dent in the universe as Steve Jobs had. And so I obviously think that, most entrepreneurs end up being relatively higher people with a higher risk appetite, or people with high aspirations, and pretty much always that drive, that need to prove yourself, to make your mark in the world, comes from not feeling seen as a child, or not feeling understood, appreciated, et cetera, et cetera. We all have our kind of shifts on it, but that's kind of the driving narrative that makes us want to prove ourselves, because we have something to prove. Maybe it was a teacher who said we were worthless, we wouldn't amount to anything. Maybe it was a parent, maybe it was a pastor. It's a little different for everyone. I think that it's important not to lose the drive, the ambition, because in many ways it can lead us to great things that actually help people.
Yeah.
But at the same time, there's deep suffering that comes from, in a sense, desire. And this is very Buddhist, but desire is actually, the object of wanting is what causes us suffering, because we want 1,000 different things. We're never going to get all of them, and we're going to suffer until we want all those things. And so I think the real truth comes from the acknowledgement that I am wanting to make my impact on a world. I am aware, though, that comes from this, maybe that I didn't like myself, that I saw a truth when that teacher told me that I couldn't amount to anything. And maybe there's this fear that they're right. And so I'm gonna start this company venture. I'm gonna start XYZ, this nonprofit. It can masquerade as really good things. I'm gonna start a church plant, like to prove them wrong. But I think that teacher is not the person we need to sort of prove wrong. It's actually ourselves. And we need to embrace that truth, that what, there's always the truth in the things that like wound us the most. It's because there's maybe a kernel of truth in there, and you say, maybe I'm not smart enough, maybe I'm not beautiful enough, maybe I'm not talented enough, and I can either outwork it, which can be a way to solve that, or I can just accept that, like, life isn't cookie cutter where it's like binaries of like you are this or you're that. Like we're all messy. We're not perfect. And we just muddle forward to just try and grow more and more each day. And the awareness can actually give us peace to just say, these are not truths. These thoughts that are coming in, these labels that are coming in, I don't have to wear these as clothes. They don't have to hold me down. It's mind. This is the practice of mindfulness where like, just clouds passing by. They can be thoughts, labels that we acknowledge that they pass, but they don't have to be something that anchors us down to the ground. And we
Mm.
move onward in hopes of creating a better future. Yeah.
Yeah. So good. I was thinking back to this idea that you were unfolding. In some ways, this idea of protecting those wounds,
Yeah.
protecting the pain, protecting what some of that stinging truth is. And it reminded me of the old story of where uh, Peter, if you remember the old story in scripture where Jesus is talking about all these things that are going to happen to him. And they're not good things. They're very difficult things. And the first thing Peter does is he gets up and he says, I'm not going to let this happen to you. And what Peter's responding to is really an internal fear,
Right.
right? His internal fear is based on some trauma that he's experienced in his own life, i.e., oppression. And he's like, well, if you suffer all these things, then the oppression that I've experienced in my life won't be fixed. And Jesus' response is very clear. I love his response because he addresses the trauma head on and says, and of course all the fellows are there, and he looks around, and I'm going to paraphrase a little bit. He says, if anyone were to come after me, in other words, anyone wants to follow me, if anyone wants to go where I'm going, step one is deny yourself. Deny all, like you were talking about the wants, right? Deny all that stuff that you want that you think is going to give you security,
Mhm.
because that security is a false security, because all you're doing is you're putting a band-aid over the wound.
Mhm.
He tells them to take up their cross. In other words, be prepared to let it all go, because that desire to want is really a crutch for you in receiving what you truly need.
Right.
And then come after me. And then he says, he finalizes the statement with this: for what does it profit a man, a person, to gain the whole world, yet forfeit his very spirit, his very soul, his very meaning in life, his reason for existence? And what a word picture in this journey that we're on, right? This journey of like, I have to, and it reminds me of the Bruce Lee story. If you ever seen the Bruce Lee story, and where the sort of the demon that he faces, it's a reflection of himself. It's this own, like
Mhm.
this own me, this picture of me that's incomplete, and I'm constantly warring against it, and I have to defeat it. I have to put it to death. And in that death, a part of me dies so that I can truly live. And that's this casting off of the yoke of bondage. And it's the question is for each of us, what is that for you? I would ask, what are some of those things in life that you experienced that you have had to, or that you're in the process of putting to death so that you could truly live?
I don't know if you're asking me personally or
I
asking the
am
audience
asking
like
you
a
personally.
pastor.
I am asking you
I was I
personally,
was I was
right? Is this
feeling
the
like a Pastor
rhetorical?
Nate moment. Yeah, yeah,
Pastor Nate.
yeah.
I used to be called that.
Yeah. Oh man. Honestly, my biggest revelation this year was that I just didn't like myself. And it's this weird paradox because I grew up like a bit of a golden child, like archetype. There's different family dysfunction archetypes, right? There's the golden child countered by the problem child. There's the scapegoat, the caretakers. There's the lost child, and there's the class clown, and then there's the mastermind. And most people kind of fall into like a dysfunctional family stereotype. But the weird thing about the golden child is they'll be so caught up trying to make others happy, safe, feel like, like it's almost like others' happiness is my responsibility. It's my, that you want everyone else to like you because really you don't like yourself. And I think in many ways, maybe we talked about this before, but like our careers are born out of our trauma. Get that, right? I grew up not feeling seen, and so I knew I needed to become a performer and a writer and a director because I wanted to be seen in a way that I didn't actually feel like anyone was giving me space. So I had to take up the space and I had to tell the stories, right? And I would wager, like, if you as the audience member would look at what you're doing now, is there any correlation between what made you feel safe as a child or what you needed as a child and the way that evolved into what we do on a daily basis now? And I think for me, the big aha moment this year, and really just in the last few months, is if I could accept myself, then it would be so much easier to accept others. It would be so much easier to accept failure in others, failure in art. I've always been so critical of my own art, my own work, my own shows, my own companies, my own relationships, because I was criticized, growing up, whether it was in the church or at home or whatever. It has this like, you cannot fail. You must be this. You must kind of be that golden child. And it caused such suffering that I then perpetuated onto others, right? It's the cycle of abuse to some degree. It's like the classic, like, parent passes down the behavior to the child, who then believes that they're doing a service by passing it on to others. But the the what we must do is to break that cycle, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Indeed. And that cycle breaking is through uh, a a release, if you will. It's not that we have to feel shame. It's not that we have to feel as though we're letting anyone down. It's simply because we're truly becoming our own selves. We are truly
That's right.
stepping into embracing our own self. And I've mentioned this before, as Maslow once said, this plan of self actualization. What a man can be, he must be, right? Or what a person can be, that person must be. If we were going to use it in
Yeah.
modern context, and it's so true. And uh, for me, it was a little different. I had I am single mom for most of my youth, and mom was brilliant. Everybody always talked about how mom was brilliant, and she was, she could remember so much, and math and science and history, and she was. And I never, my mom, God bless her, she told me I can do anything, but at the same time, she never let me win at anything without truly winning. In other words, we would play cards. I had to be 9, I think, before the first time I beat her at cards, and she just would not let me win. She would. I had to win fair. I had to outsmart her, and it was almost impossible. And I always, I would bring her things that I thought were fantastic that I did, and you remember Gru? Like, I always felt like my mom was Gru's mom. Like, man, here's a I made this cool space craft, right, at age 7, and it's like, meh. So no matter what it was, straight A's, meh. I expect that of you.
Yeah.
But here's the flip side of it. And I love my mom, and I love her dearly. And I want to say that as a warrant or a caveat to what I'm going to say. I never felt smart enough.
That's right.
I always felt like, man, I need to be smarter. And that was a hole. That was a hole. And even to this day, I have to remind people, it's like, oh, you're so smart. I'm like, am I?
Yep.
You know what I mean?
Yep.
And it's this thrust that it's very difficult to shake.
Yeah.
Uh, in stepping into that truth um, of where is my approval lying?
That's right.
Yeah, where is that lying? And is it lying in the truth of who I am and who I am accepted to be? And this goes back to our conversation around faith, right? And it's like, for me, as a person of faith, it's like, you know what? It's all I need is God's approval, and God's given me God's approval. So like everything else should be gravy. I shouldn't be worried about anyone else. I should always strive for my very best, but not because I need to please anyone.
That's right.
Because if you attempt to please the whole world, you're probably not going to please anyone.
Yeah. Least of all yourself.
Most importantly, yourself.
You know.
Yeah. And so this is, I want to bring this full circle. So this is where Harry Potter is trying to understand who he is, because he has been under this protection, if you will. Right? First the protection of his uncle and his aunt, and then the protection of this marking, if you will, right? Because he was the boy who lived. But what needs to happen in the end? I don't know. Spoiler alert, let's go ahead and tell people.
It's like 20 years old at this point. We're good.
Yeah, everybody who's meant to, yeah, pretty much. Yeah. He dies.
Yep.
He has to, back to this, this ancient story, right? Take up your cross. Like you have to be prepared to let let whatever was keeping you safe in the past as a child through the trauma, you have to bury it. You have to let it die so that you can truly, truly live. And that's different for every person. But it's essential to stepping into your true self.
I can't follow that up. It's a mic drop moment. It's true. I think, like I said before, all the things we want in life are often on the other side of the things we fear the most. And some of the best moments of like just crying and realizing like, oh my gosh, I've never felt better, I've never felt more accepted, are on the other side of like just letting go, just kind of dying to those old beliefs that kept us in bondage. I like think of it as clothes. We keep putting on layers of clothes that are like labels and self identities, and then we try and go swimming and we realize like this is just letting us sink to the bottom. We got
Yeah.
to take off some of this, right?
It's counterintuitive to think that what kept me safe, protecting myself,
Yeah,
is the opposite of what can liberate me, vulnerability.
that's right.
Uh, it is. It's counterintuitive, the self preservation. Like true release is a release of that preservation, because we think, well, but don't I have more? Am I not in more harm's way when I'm not wearing all these clothes? The problem is that those clothes were not designed for swimming.
That's right.
Just like that ship was not designed to sit in the harbor. It's not what we were made for. There's time for that clothes. There's time for those clothes. Um, but not when you are prepared uh, to go on that journey that's necessary in those waters. And you have to be discerning. You have to know when is appropriate. But even then, uh, it's so important to examine ourselves, and not alone, by the way. Sometimes it's, we've talked about this before, in the company of others
Yeah,
who desire the best for us, to eliminate those pathways with individuals who have no business in helping us, just like Harry. Where would he have gotten without his friends?
yeah. Yep. We are a product of those we surround ourselves with. And maybe I feel obliged to just brag on my wife as always is, the reason I've been on this inner work journey is because she's been so committed to her own inner work, her own story work, unpacking a lot of these truths. And so it's essential that we surround ourselves with those who are committed to doing their being centered. It's like it's always that, how do you think of yourself less? Well, that whole philosophy. I think the ways in which we can care most for others is by caring the most for ourselves, but in a way that in conversations, it's not like we have all this messy, it's like it's once we do this inner work of understanding how to be at peace, it's so much easier to actually focus on healing for others. But it's okay to be messy at the same time, right? And that's why we have those deep relationships in which we can unpack some of this stuff with, right?
And it's okay to get messy. I mean,
Yeah.
same. My spouse, gosh, man, if I wouldn't have had my wife all these years, and there's been lots of great tension over the years, and lots of refocusing, and it continues to happen every day. Just last night, we were having some refocusing, and I was like, thank you for helping me because you've got my six. You are here, and I'm here, and we're going to do this together, and be vulnerable, even if it hurts a bit.
It always hurts.
Yeah,
It does. Yeah, I think vulnerability almost always hurts. I don't think you ever grow out of like uh I don't know, acknowledging deficiencies, acknowledging the pain of life. But it doesn't have to stop you from sitting in that, resting in that, pushing through that.
yeah, because that you know that there is peace.
That's right. And oftentimes it only can be found on the other side of embracing it.
Yeah, love it, and I love you.
Yeah, I love you too, Nate. Thank you for having me on. Good old therapy session.
I know someone was blessed today. Thanks for being
Yeah.
here, brother.
Yeah. Thank you for having me on. Take care.